By 1943, the war had turned against Germany, but Hitler wasn't ready to accept defeat. He had built something that, in his mind, was impenetrable: the Atlantic Wall. Stretching more than 2,000 miles along the western coast of Europe, it was the largest defensive network ever built. From the icy beaches of Norway to the warm sands of southern France, the wall was lined with concrete bunkers, artillery nests, and machine gun turrets. Miles of barbed wire, mines, and steel obstacles turned every inch of coastline into a death trap. Hitler called it his Fortress Europe, and he believed it would make an Allied invasion impossible. But the Allies had no choice. They had to break through that wall, and soon. The Soviets were bleeding millions of men fighting in the east. Stalin demanded a second front in the west to relieve the pressure. If the Americans and British didn't act soon, the Red Army might conquer all of Europe before they even landed. There was only one way to do it: cross the English Channel and storm the beaches of France. But there was a problem. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where. For months, German intelligence analysts studied every possible coastline, every potential landing site. The shortest and most logical route from England to France was at Calais, only 21 miles across the Channel. It had a major port, good roads, and was within range of German artillery batteries. To Hitler it was obvious. Calais had to be the target. But the Allies had other plans. They knew Calais was too obvious, too heavily defended. Instead, they chose a more dangerous but less fortified location: the beaches of Normandy. The problem was, if the Germans realized that Normandy was the real target, they could move hundreds of thousands of troops there and crush the invasion before it began. Even a few extra days of German reinforcements could mean total disaster. So the Allies came up with a plan not to destroy Hitler's defences, but to deceive them. If they could convince Hitler that the real invasion was coming at Calais, not Normandy, then the Germans would keep their strongest forces in the wrong place, and when the real invasion began, they would be too slow to react. It was a plan that required imagination, precision, and a level of trickery the world had never seen before. Fake radio messages, inflatable tanks, phantom divisions, even fake generals. The mission would combine artists, engineers, and intelligence officers, men who could lie better than anyone else on Earth. They weren't trained to shoot, they were trained to pretend. But the stakes couldn't be higher. If the deception failed, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would die on the beaches of Normandy. If it succeeded, it could end the war. To fool Hitler, they would have to create an entire army, one that didn't exist. An army that moved, communicated, and looked exactly like the real thing. An army that could trick the most paranoid man in history. And so began one of the boldest operations of World War II, Operation Fortitude, the plan to sell the biggest lie of the 20th century. The clock was ticking, D-Day was approaching, and the Allies had only a few months to make Hitler believe in an army that was made of nothing but air. The idea sounded insane at first: create a fake army, an entire fighting force, out of rubber, plywood, and sound recordings. But desperate times called for desperate imagination. The seed of the plan was planted inside the British intelligence network, known as the London Controlling Section, led by a quiet genius named Colonel John Bevan. His team specialised in one thing: deception. They had already fooled the Germans before, planting fake spies, fake radio codes, even fake corpses carrying fake invasion plans. But this new mission was on another level. To sell the illusion, they would need three things: a fake army big enough to seem real, a story believable enough to confuse the enemy, and a man charismatic enough to lead it. That man would be General George S. Patton, America's most feared commander. After the Allied victory in Sicily, Patton's reputation was legendary. The Germans respected him more than any other general alive. So when British and American intelligence officers learned that Hitler considered Patton the key to the next invasion, they saw an opportunity. They decided to build a ghost army around him, an imaginary army called the 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it looked massive. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and landing craft, and every type of weapon imaginable. In reality, it didn't exist. What did exist was a small team of artists, engineers, and signal operators, no more than 1,100 men, trained to bring this illusion to life. They were handpicked from art schools, advertising agencies, and even Hollywood sound studios. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were creators, painters, set designers, architects, and radio experts. Their mission was simple in words but impossible in practice. Make the Germans believe this fake army was real. Every sound, every shadow, every radio transmission had to feel authentic. If one detail looked off, the Germans would see through the lie. To the Allies, this deception wasn't just a trick, it was a weapon of confusion, a psychological strike powerful enough to hold back Hitler's divisions from the real invasion site. The unit began their secret training in 1943. At night, they practiced inflating rubber tanks and trucks in total silence, learning how to build a camp that looked real from the sky. They learned how to drive empty jeeps in circles to create tire tracks, how to record tank noises and play them through massive speakers, and how to scatter fake equipment to make aerial photos believable. It was theatre, performed on the world's deadliest stage. The men quickly earned a nickname, the Ghost Army. But they didn't mind. They took pride in their strange mission. Some even joked that they were actors in the greatest play of all time. Everywhere they went, secrecy followed. They couldn't tell their families what they were doing. They couldn't write home about the strange rubber tanks or the fake convoys. To the outside world, they were just another ordinary engineering unit. But behind closed doors, they were planning a performance that would deceive an empire. As D-Day drew closer, the Ghost Army's stage was ready. The southern coast of England. The goal was to make Hitler believe Patton's fake army was gathering there, preparing to cross the Channel and attack Calais. Thousands of dummy vehicles, fake radio signals, and misleading spy reports were set in motion. Soon, German planes flying overhead would see what appeared to be the largest invasion force ever assembled. They'd report back to Berlin with proof of Patton's army ready to strike. And that was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. For now, the stage was set, the props were built, and the greatest illusion in history was about to begin. By early 1944, the plan had a name, Operation Fortitude. It wasn't just one deception. It was a web of lies so complex that even Allied commanders had trouble keeping track of it all. Fortitude had two parts. Fortitude North, designed to make Hitler think the Allies would invade Norway, and Fortitude South, the main act, the grand illusion that a massive army was gathering in southeast England to attack Calais. The goal was simple, make Hitler's spies so sure of the wrong invasion site that he'd move his troops there and leave Normandy weak. To pull this off, Allied intelligence turned Britain into a living movie set. They began with radio deception. Skilled operators pretended to be entire divisions, sending constant chatter about troop movements, fuel shortages, and fake supply schedules. Every day, thousands of lines of code and reports filled the airwaves, all meaningless, but convincing enough to seem real. Then came the visual deception. Aerial reconnaissance was one of Germany's greatest tools. If Hitler could see an army forming, he'd believe it. So the Allies gave him exactly what he wanted to see. Across the countryside of Kent and Sussex, fake camps began to appear. Inflatable tanks, rubber jeeps, and wooden artillery were laid out in perfect military formations. From the sky, they looked indistinguishable from the real thing. They even staged fake supply lines, trucks made of canvas, fuel depots made of painted barrels, and landing craft that never touched water. At night, soldiers lit fake campfires and parked empty vehicles in neat rows. It looked alive, it looked ready, and that was the point. German reconnaissance planes snapped thousands of photos, sending them straight to Berlin. When intelligence officers analysed them, they were convinced. Patton's first US Army group was real, and it was coming for Calais. But the Allies didn't stop there. They used spies, double agents planted deep inside Nazi intelligence, to reinforce the lie. One of them was Juan Pujol Garcia, known by his codename Garbo. He was a master storyteller, feeding Berlin hundreds of fake reports about the build-up of Patton's army. He wrote about soldiers training for amphibious landings, about warehouses full of ammunition, about secret inspections from Patton himself. Every report made its way to Hitler's desk, and the Führer believed every word. Meanwhile, the real invasion force, the one that would strike Normandy, was quietly preparing hundreds of miles away, hidden under total secrecy. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Even some Allied soldiers believed the fake story, thinking they were part of a diversion. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of fake vehicles, entire units that didn't exist, hundreds of radio operators faking conversations around the clock. It was an army made of air, sound, and imagination. But for all its brilliance, fortitude depended on one fragile thing: belief. If even one piece of evidence contradicted the illusion, the whole operation could collapse. The Germans were watching closely, listening carefully, and analysing everything. One real tank parked in the wrong spot could give it all away. One radio mistake could expose the entire network. The men behind Fortitude knew it. Every night they worked under pressure, refining their signals, double-checking every photo, and coordinating every movement to perfection. As spring turned to summer, reports from German intelligence grew more confident. Hitler was certain that the invasion would strike Calais. He began shifting his strongest panzer divisions north, exactly as the Allies hoped. The deception was working. Slowly, carefully, the Ghost Army's illusion was taking hold inside Hitler's mind. But the real test was yet to come, because while Hitler stared at the fake build-up in Calais, the real invasion fleet was already preparing to sail toward Normandy. And when the first Allied ships hit the beaches, the fate of the war would depend on whether Hitler continued to believe the lie. June 6, 1944. The day the world had been waiting for. D-Day. Before dawn, thousands of Allied ships set sail across the dark, cold waters of the English Channel. Men who had trained for years sat in silence, clutching their rifles, whispering prayers. Above them, aircraft filled the skies like a storm cloud. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe had begun. But even as the largest armada in history crossed the Channel, one question haunted every Allied commander. Would Hitler believe the deception? If he saw through the illusion and sent his forces to Normandy, the invasion could end in disaster within hours. But if he continued to believe the fake build-up at Calais, then the Allies might just pull off the impossible. By 6:30 a.m., the first waves of troops hit the beaches of Normandy: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The sea turned red. Machine guns tore through the morning fog. Men fell, crawled, and pushed forward under a rain of bullets. It was chaos. But amid the smoke and blood, something strange was happening on the German side. In Berlin, Hitler was asleep. When his generals received word that Allied forces had landed in Normandy, they hesitated to wake him. They believed it wasn't the real invasion, only a diversion meant to distract from the true attack that was still coming at Calais. Hours passed. Even as reports poured in of thousands of Allied soldiers storming the beaches, the German High Command refused to move its elite panzer divisions. They were ordered to stay near Calais, to wait for Patton's army. But Patton's army didn't exist. The deception had worked. The fake camps, the inflatable tanks, the phony radio traffic, it had all burrowed deep into Hitler's thinking. He was convinced Normandy was a trap, a distraction, a trick to lure him away from the real invasion. All through D-Day, German commanders in France begged for reinforcements. But Hitler's orders were clear: hold the line. The main attack was still coming at Calais. This single decision changed everything. By the time Hitler realized the truth, that Normandy was the real invasion, it was too late. The Allies had already secured the beaches. More than 150,000 troops had landed, tanks were rolling inland, and supply ships were unloading non-stop. The gateway to Western Europe was open. Still, the deception had to continue. The Allies couldn't afford to let Hitler shift his focus yet. So even after D-Day, the Ghost Army kept up the illusion. Fake radio messages continued to buzz through the air. Double agents kept sending reports of Patton's army waiting for orders. German intelligence remained convinced that the attack on Calais was only days away. For weeks after D-Day, Hitler refused to move key divisions from the north. He believed the Normandy landings were merely the first wave, a diversion before Patton's real assault began. Every hour that belief lasted saved Allied lives. It gave the invasion time to breathe, to strengthen, to expand. The beaches turned into ports, supply chains grew, and soon entire cities were being liberated. By the time the German High Command finally realized there would be no second invasion, it was too late. The Allies had broken through Normandy and were marching toward Paris, and all of it, every step, every victory was made possible by a lie, Operation Fortitude had done its job. It had blinded Hitler at the most crucial moment of the war. It had turned rubber, canvas, and imagination into one of the most powerful weapons of the 20th century. But for the men behind the illusion, the artists, engineers, and sound experts who had built a fake army out of nothing, their mission was far from over. Because while the world celebrated the success of D-Day, they were already preparing for their next act. The Ghost Army wasn't done deceiving. Their tricks would soon move from England to the battlefields of France itself, where the line between illusion and survival would blur forever. After D-Day, the beaches of Normandy turned into a living machine. Every day, new troops, vehicles, and supplies poured in. The Allies had secured their foothold, but the fight for Europe had only begun. Behind the scenes, the deception team received new orders. The mission that had started on the shores of England was now moving across the Channel. The Ghost Army was going to war, but not with bullets or bombs. Their job was to confuse, not destroy, to distract, not conquer, to make the enemy see things that weren't there. By July 1944, the Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, landed in France. They carried no heavy weapons, no real tanks, and no artillery. Their arsenal consisted of rubber, paint, wood, and sound. At first glance, their equipment looked absurd. Inflatable Sherman tanks that could be carried by 4 men, trucks with wooden frames and canvas shells, massive loudspeakers that could project the roar of an armoured division for miles. But these strange tools were about to save lives. Their first mission on French soil came near the city of St. Lo. The front lines were shifting fast, and the Germans still didn't know where the Allies would strike next. The Ghost Army was sent ahead to stage a fake build-up, a phantom armoured division, to draw enemy fire away from the real one. At night they worked under blackout. Teams of soldiers rolled out rubber tanks, inflated them in fields, and arranged them in perfect formations. Engineers wired sound systems to play the rumble of engines, the clank of metal tracks, and the voices of men shouting commands. From a distance it sounded like an entire army preparing for battle. To make it even more convincing, the unit's artists painted insignias of real divisions onto the dummy vehicles. Their radio teams mimicked authentic signals, replicating the chatter of officers, drivers, and supply depots. Even military police were stationed on nearby roads, waving traffic around as if real convoys were passing through. By dawn, enemy reconnaissance aircraft spotted the army. Within hours, German artillery opened fire on the decoys. While shells exploded harmlessly over empty fields, the real Allied troops advanced elsewhere, unnoticed. It was working. Every deception bought time, saved soldiers, and stretched German defences thinner and thinner. But it wasn't easy. Operating so close to the front lines meant the Ghost Army was constantly under threat. Their fake camps could be discovered at any moment. One curious German patrol could ruin everything. To protect their secret, the men often had to pack up and move before sunrise, deflating tanks and dismantling entire setups in minutes. Sometimes they worked so close to combat zones that they could hear gunfire echoing across the hills. Still, they kept performing their strange, silent art. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Ghost Army followed, staging one illusion after another near Saint-Lô, Le Mans, and the Loire Valley. Each operation was different, but the goal remained the same: confuse the enemy long enough for the real divisions to strike elsewhere. To the German high command, it must have seemed like the Allies were everywhere at once. Massive armoured divisions appearing overnight, entire units vanishing the next day. They couldn't tell what was real anymore. For the Ghost Army, that confusion was victory. Every fake tank inflated, every sound broadcast, every false signal. It all meant fewer men dying on the real front lines. But the deeper they moved into Europe, the risk grew. The war was far from over, and soon they would face their biggest challenge yet. A deception so bold it could decide the fate of the entire Western Front. By August 1944, France was burning with chaos. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing toward Paris, but German resistance was still fierce. Every road, every bridge, every field could hide an ambush. To win, the Allies needed one final breakthrough, and the Ghost Army was about to help deliver it. The mission this time was different. It wasn't just about distracting the enemy from afar. It was about standing in the open, pretending to be real soldiers, and risking their lives for a lie. The operation took place near the town of Le Mans. The goal convinced the Germans that the US 6th Armoured Division, a powerful real unit, was setting up camp nearby. If the enemy took the bait, they'd attack the ghosts instead of the real troops moving secretly toward the front. It was one of the most dangerous acts of theatre in military history. At dusk, the ghost army rolled into empty farmland. Trucks unloaded piles of folded rubber, and within hours the fields were filled with the silhouettes of tanks, artillery and trucks. Generators hummed as speakers blared engine sounds across the countryside. Men walked between the dummies shouting fake commands, adjusting equipment, and even hanging laundry on lines. Tiny human details that made the illusion feel alive. From above, the scene looked completely authentic. German reconnaissance planes took photographs and immediately reported the presence of a full armoured division. Within hours, German artillery began shelling the fake camp. The explosions lit up the night sky, but the only casualties were air-filled tanks and empty tents. The real 6th Armoured Division slipped through the countryside untouched, advancing to strike where the Germans least expected it. It was a perfect performance, but it came at a cost. The men of the Ghost Army could never fight back. When shells fell around them, all they could do was duck, cover and pray the enemy never discovered what they really were. Their rifles were mostly props. Their power came from silence. One soldier later recalled, "We couldn't fire back. We couldn't even make noise. If they found out what we were, they'd kill us all." Despite the danger, the unit's confidence grew. Each successful illusion proved how powerful deception could be. They weren't just tricking German scouts anymore. They were bending the perception of entire divisions. As the Allies advanced toward Paris, the Ghost Army set up more fake camps to keep the Germans guessing. Sometimes they impersonated infantry units, sometimes armoured divisions, sometimes they created fake bridges to make it seem like the Allies were crossing rivers that didn't exist. Their deception became so convincing that even Allied pilots occasionally mistook them for real units. That's how real it looked. By late August, Paris was liberated. Crowds cheered as the French capital was freed from Nazi control. But the Ghost Army didn't celebrate. Their work wasn't over. The front lines were moving east now, toward Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany itself. The closer they got to the heart of the Reich, the more desperate the Germans became, and that desperation made the Ghost Army's job harder than ever. Every deception now carried a deadly risk. German forces were watching more closely, striking faster and trusting less. One mistake, one misplaced tank, one wrong radio signal could expose everything. But the men didn't stop. They had become addicted to the illusion. It was dangerous, secret and strange. But they knew their lies were saving thousands of real lives. Each time a fake army drew enemy fire somewhere else, a real one moved safely forward. Each time a decoy fooled a German scout, real soldiers survived another day. They were invisible heroes, the artists of war, and their masterpiece was yet to come. Because soon the Ghost Army would face their biggest challenge, the deception that would take them to the edge of defeat and the edge of discovery. By September 1944, the tide of war had turned, but victory was still far away. The Allies were deep inside Europe now, pushing toward the German border, and for the Ghost Army, every new mission was more dangerous than the last. Their success had become their curse. Each deception fooled the Germans so completely that the enemy had begun hunting them. German commanders started to realize something strange. Some American divisions seemed to appear and disappear overnight. Entire armoured units would show up in reconnaissance photos one day and vanish the next. It didn't make sense. Unless the Americans had a trick. That's when the Ghost Army became a target. In September, during the Moselle River campaign in France, the unit was assigned to simulate the 6th Armoured Division once again. The real 6th was preparing for a surprise assault elsewhere, and the Ghosts needed to draw fire away from them. So, under pouring rain, they rolled into an open field and inflated dozens of Sherman tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Mud swallowed their boots. The air reeked of diesel and rubber. They planted fake radio antennas, strung up camouflage nets, and began transmitting false chatter about tank repairs and fuel shortages. It was an art form, and every detail mattered. For days, German scouts watched through binoculars from the hills. Then the shelling began. The first explosion hit near the centre of camp, ripping open a dummy tank like a balloon. Another shell landed closer, showering the men with mud and shrapnel. They had to stay perfectly calm. If they ran, the enemy would know it was a fake. If they fired back, they'd expose themselves. All they could do was keep the act alive. One man kept turning wrenches on an empty engine block as shells exploded around him. Another calmly carried a bucket of mud to patch a fake tank tread. Every motion had to look authentic, even in chaos. For hours, the Germans pounded the fake position. But the deception worked. The enemy believed they had pinned down a full American division and diverted reinforcements toward the decoy site. Meanwhile, the real 6th Armoured swept forward through the flank, capturing key crossings along the Moselle. When the smoke cleared, the Ghosts surveyed the destruction. Half their inflatables were shredded, their radios were nearly useless, and several men were wounded, but not one of them broke character. The lie had held. Still, the cost was becoming clear. The closer they moved toward Germany, the more dangerous their game became. The Ghost Army had no armour, no heavy weapons, and no backup. If they were ever caught, they'd be slaughtered. Word spread among the men that the Germans had started issuing orders. If you capture these fake units, execute them on the spot. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense anymore. They were illusionists in enemy territory, and one mistake could end everything. Despite the fear, the men kept going. Some said the tension bonded them more deeply than any other unit. They had seen death without ever firing a shot. They had stood under artillery fire while pretending to fix tanks that weren't real. They had lied their way through hell and won. But the worst was yet to come, because as 1944 drew to a close, the weather turned cold, the skies darkened, and a massive German counterattack was about to begin. It would be the last major offensive of the war, and it would push the Ghost Army to the brink of annihilation. The men didn't know it yet, but they were about to face their most dangerous mission. A deception operation so close to the front lines they could hear the enemy breathing. And this time, one wrong move wouldn't just blow their cover. It could change the course of the entire war. December 1944. Snow blanketed the forests of Belgium, and the war that many believed was nearly over suddenly exploded back to life. Hitler had launched a massive surprise counterattack, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. For the Ghost Army, it was the closest they would ever come to true combat. Their mission was simple on paper, but nearly suicidal in reality: to hold the line by illusion alone. The German advance had punched deep into Allied territory, and chaos rippled across the front. Tanks were burning, units were retreating, and communication had broken down completely. The Ghosts were ordered to create the illusion of strength, to make the Germans believe that fresh American divisions had arrived to reinforce the line. In truth, there were no reinforcements, just them. They arrived in the frozen Ardennes under cover of darkness. The snow fell silently over their deflated tanks, their trucks, and their crates of rubber illusions. Men shivered as they unpacked the equipment. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. They worked through the night, inflating tanks, setting up artillery, and arranging fake supply lines in the open fields. The goal was to make it look like the US 75th Infantry Division had taken position there. But this was no longer a game played in the rear. They were now just a few miles from German armour. They could hear machine guns echoing through the valley. At night, flares lit up the sky like lightning. Every sound could give them away. Every whisper could cost them their lives. One of the sergeants later recalled, "You could see their headlights moving through the trees. We were pretending to be an army that didn't exist, and praying they wouldn't come check." They set up fake campfires, hung laundry on lines, and even drove jeeps in loops to leave convincing tyre tracks. Radio operators filled the airwaves with fake messages, reports about troop movements, supply shortages, artillery support, all the small details that made an army look real. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, and somehow it worked. German reconnaissance planes flying overhead reported a massive US build-up in the sector. Intercepted messages showed that Hitler's commanders began redirecting units to face what they thought was a major Allied counterattack. The real Allied forces, battered and exhausted, gained precious time to regroup. But that illusion came at a cost. The cold was merciless. Many of the men had no winter clothing. They slept inside their trucks, wrapping themselves in canvas to stay warm. Their hands froze as they patched holes in inflatable tanks torn by the ice, and through it all they could hear the rumble of real German panzers moving nearby. One night, A reconnaissance patrol from the enemy side stumbled dangerously close to their lines. The Ghosts had no choice but to stay perfectly still, surrounded by rubber tanks and fake guns. If one man coughed, they'd all be dead. Minutes felt like hours, and then, as suddenly as they appeared, the Germans moved on. The silence that followed was deafening. When the battle finally ended weeks later, the Allies had pushed the Germans back, but the cost was enormous. Thousands had died in the snow. The Ghost Army had lost none to direct combat, but their nerves were shredded. They had stood on the front line of one of the bloodiest battles of the war without ever firing a shot. Yet their deception had bought the Allies a vital window. That window allowed General Patton to move his forces north, break through the German lines, and ultimately turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. The Ghosts never got the glory. They were forbidden from telling anyone what they'd done. No medals, no headlines, just orders to pack up their illusions and move to the next field. But deep down they knew what they had achieved. They had saved real soldiers, thousands of them, by pretending to be ghosts in the snow. And as the front line pushed toward Germany, the men began to realize something else. Their strange secret war was nearing its end. But before it did, they had one more performance left, their grand finale. Because soon the Ghost Army would stage the most daring deception of the entire European campaign, a final illusion that would bring them face to face with the enemy and with history itself. March 1945. The end was in sight. The Allies had pushed deep into Germany, and the mighty Rhine River now stood as the last great natural barrier before the heart of the Third Reich. Crossing it would open the road to Berlin, but Hitler wasn't about to make it easy. Every bridge across the Rhine had been fortified, mined, or destroyed. German artillery covered the far banks. Any real attempt to cross risked massive casualties. So once again, when brute force wasn't enough, the Allies turned to deception, and there was only one group who could pull it off: the men of the Ghost Army. Their mission convinced the Germans that the main Allied crossing would happen far north of where it actually would. They had to create the illusion of an entire armoured division, tanks, trucks, artillery, radio chatter and supply convoys, all preparing to storm the Rhine. In truth, the real crossing would take place 60 miles south, under the command of General Patton. But if the Ghost Army could keep the Germans looking in the wrong direction for just a few days, Patton could strike before they even realised it. It was the most ambitious performance of their secret war. They rolled into the area near the Rhine in late February, under heavy fog and constant enemy surveillance. Every movement had to be perfect. Every sound had to sell the illusion. They started by inflating hundreds of rubber Shermans, positioning them in neat rows across open fields where German spotters could see them. They used bulldozers to dig fake tank tracks and trenches. Engineers erected decoy pontoon bridges that led halfway across the river, complete with wooden planks, ropes, and even empty fuel cans to make it look used. From the air, it was flawless. Meanwhile, their radio operators flooded the airwaves with coded chatter about ammunition shortages and bridge preparations. Truck drivers ran fake convoys day and night, looping endlessly through the same roads to simulate constant reinforcements. At night, they lit campfires and set up bright spotlights to mimic welding and bridge construction. And the soundtrack to it all was chaos. Engineers banged metal sheets together to mimic the sounds of tanks being repaired. Loudspeakers blasted recorded engine roars and hammering at random intervals. Even the locals believed a real army was assembling there. Then, in the middle of all that noise, the Ghosts added their final touch, a deception so bold it bordered on theatre. They placed dummy command tents with fake generals' names painted on the doors. They drove jeeps marked with the insignia of Patton's Third Army. To any spy, any observer, it was clear. This was where the Allies would cross, and the Germans took the bait. Within days, enemy divisions began repositioning to defend the Northern Rhine. Heavy artillery and panzer units moved north, away from Patton's real crossing point at Oppenheim. By the time Hitler realised what was happening, it was too late. On the night of March 22nd, under cover of darkness, Patton's troops silently crossed the Rhine, unopposed, unexpected, and unstoppable. They built pontoon bridges in record time, ferried tanks across the river, and poured into Germany before the enemy could react. When news reached Berlin, Hitler was furious. He demanded to know how the Allies had crossed so easily. But the truth was simple. While the real soldiers moved south, Hitler had been fighting shadows. The Ghost Army had done it again. In the days that followed, as the Rhine bridgeheads expanded and Germany's defences crumbled, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed up their inflatable tanks one last time. For nearly a year they had played a part no one else could, a travelling circus of illusionists, engineers and artists who turned deception into a weapon. As they deflated the last rubber tank, one of the men joked, "Guess we'll put these back in the toy box." But behind the laughter was something deeper: exhaustion, pride, and the quiet realization that they had just helped end the most devastating war in human history without ever firing a shot. Their job was over. Their existence would remain a secret for decades. But before they vanished into history's shadows, the Ghost Army had pulled off one final miracle. They'd made the enemy believe in ghosts. In the grand story of World War II, there were heroes who stormed beaches, flew through flak-filled skies and fought in the mud. But there was another kind of hero, one who carried paintbrushes instead of rifles, sound speakers instead of machine guns, and rubber tanks instead of steel. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They were artists, stage designers, architects and sound engineers. Men who once built theatre sets and painted billboards, suddenly building an army that didn't exist. For nearly a year they lived a lie so convincing it became truth in the minds of the enemy. Their decoys drew fire meant for real soldiers. Their fake bridges diverted tanks away from real ones. Their phantom armies reshaped battlefields without firing a single bullet. And that's what makes their story so remarkable. Because in a war defined by destruction, the Ghost Army fought with imagination. They weaponized creativity. They made deception an art form and turned illusion into armor. When the war ended in 1945, their mission didn't make the headlines. The world celebrated victory, but their story was buried under secrecy. For decades, even their families didn't know what they had done. They simply returned home, took off their uniforms, and disappeared back into civilian life. It wasn't until half a century later that their files were declassified, and the world finally discovered the truth. The truth that a handful of artists had once built a fake army so real, even Hitler's best intelligence couldn't tell the difference. Their tactics shaped the future. Today, every modern military uses deception inspired by them. From inflatable decoys in the Gulf War to fake airfields and radar signals in modern conflicts, their fingerprints are everywhere. Because they proved that sometimes what you make the enemy believe matters more than what you actually have, and in that sense their work never ended. Their legacy lives on, in every false signal, every decoy, every psychological operation carried out in the name of strategy. The world learned that imagination, in the hands of the clever, can be just as powerful as firepower in the hands of the strong. But beyond the strategy, their story is human. It's a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, creativity found a way to shine. That art, the same thing used to entertain, inspire and dream, was also used to save lives. They weren't ghosts in the supernatural sense. They were ghosts because they were unseen, unheard, uncredited. Yet their work haunted history. They turned cardboard, sound and paint into weapons of hope. And when the world needed it most, their illusion became real enough to change its fate. So when we look back at World War II, at the tanks, the battles, the generals and the glory, we should also remember the men who fought with rubber and rope, the ones who stood in empty fields, crafting shadows that terrified an empire, the ones who built an army of air and made it matter. They were never meant to be famous, but their story endures because it reveals something timeless, that courage doesn't always come with a gun, and victory doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from imagination, and that's how a few dozen dreamers, armed with nothing but art, sound and deception, helped save Europe from tyranny. They were the invisible soldiers, the forgotten artists of war, the masters of illusion who turned lies into life-saving truth. They were the Ghost Army, the cardboard army that saved Europe.